I've recorded the auction and cut out all of the bidding so that all you see is the hammer fall. This has shortened the auction from about 2 hours down to about 20 minutes of viewing. But this will give you the opportunity to scroll forward or back through this video to look at the individual items that you're interested in and see how they landed as far as price was concerned. Of course, you won't be able to go into the items because this is a recording of the screen. To see the items and the details, you'll have to actually go to Abby's auctions. If the details of that auction is still available, you'll be able to see it there. But today we're just going to go through some of the interesting facts that come out of this whole process. One of the key ones is that this was about 1,000 items, thereabouts. It was 266 lots that were sold. And of that, there were 42 different winning bidders. Of those 42 bidders, 3 of them spent about $25,000 on the auction, including the buyer's premium. The seller made $61,000 and change. With the buyer's premium, the buyers spent $76,000, with the auction house taking just shy of $15,000. The interesting point that comes out of that is that a lot of the big dollar items and many of the smaller items went for no more than half of the value that they've been seen to achieve on places like eBay. So if the buyer was to have sold all of these items via eBay, that $76,000 could have easily been $150,000. Now, if we be reasonably conservative and take an 80-20 rule approach to it, that 150 then drops down to about $120,000. But still, $120,000 is still a substantial increase over the $60,000 that the buyer got through this process. It's double. So, taking that in mind, is it worth doing this or selling individually? Now, the buyers aren't paying for delivery at this stage. They're going to have to organise couriers or go to the auction house themselves to pick up the items. Either way, they're up for additional cost on this. So if the seller was to sell these through eBay, it would be reasonable to expect that the buyers would have paid the same price that they paid, or more, given that eBay is expected to draw double and pay for postage on top of that as well. So we don't need to accommodate for postage in that $120,000. What we do need to accommodate for is eBay taking their fees. Now, a good rule of thumb is to take about 15% off in fees. So that $120,000 then turns into about $18,000 worth of fees, and that brings us down to about $100,000, which is still $40,000 more than what the seller got through this auction process. What we haven't accounted for yet, though, is the packaging, travelling to the post office, the time taken to go through all of this process, to ship them all, dealing with people saying I'm not happy, possibly wanting to return them, cancellations, having to re-auction, all of these wonderful sorts of things is where that $40,000 worth of value is. Now, if the seller has nothing better to do and is quite happy to go through that process, it's the equivalent of a job. And you could look at it as being, taking 6 months to sell them all, say. It could take longer, but let's assume 6 months to sell them all. Many of the big dollar items would likely sell quicker. So for 6 months, $40,000 is an $80,000 a year income. A bit more than that because you would be paying tax as well. So let's call it $100,000. But that $40,000 is money in the seller's pocket. So how much is that worth to the seller? And how much is their time worth going through all of those processes and the stresses of going through that selling process? That's where an auction house like this starts to show its value, because they handle all of that. They handle all the legalities. They handle all the buyers, and the buyers have signed into a contract when they've registered to say that they're paying for it and they're taking it once they've bid on it. Something that eBay doesn't enforce. eBay allows for sellers to back out even after the auctions have closed. eBay is not really an auction site anymore. It's a retail store based on a bidding process. So an auction site like this does provide some benefits to the seller that is worth real money to the seller. Basically what the seller's doing is outsourcing that whole process and paying for it on the outsource position. If they were to compensate themselves and pay themselves a wage for all the time that they spent packaging up items, going to the post office, dealing with communications with buyers, going through the eBay process, they may be paying themselves $40,000 to do that. If they've already gone into retirement, they may want to do something else that's worth a lot more than $40,000 to them. Or they may do another job that earns more than $40,000 for them in the 6-month period. It's hard to say. This is a decision by the individual. eBay has its advantages on turning things over and making money, or offsetting the cost of something and getting some return back and making the original cost not as much, deducting the value you've got while you've had the item. There are a number of approaches to take, and eBay has its place around that. But there's no denying that eBay also has its overhead on time and stress. The auction house takes all that away. So the seller now gets to say to the auction house, here are all the items, sell them. The auction house takes it on, they make a percentage on top that the buyer pays for, and then at the end of the day, they give the seller a check and say, here you go, you no longer have to worry about it. And in this case, that check was just over $60,000. So for the seller in this case, that may have been perfect. They've got the money up front, they haven't had to wait for it, they can invest that money could be earning additional money. They haven't had the stress, they haven't had the delays, they haven't had the time commitments to move the stock. All up, it's not a bad way to deal with your collection. All depends on what's important to you. A couple of other items that were of interest is, here are the averages of the key items that, as I saw them, of interest to me, and I suspect of interest to a number of others. One thing to note is that there were a couple of lots that had bundles, so there might be the likes of a 604 bedrock plane combined with a number 4 plane. They're not in these numbers because that would take me extra time to wheedle those out. So these are purely where the number 4s, 5s, 6s were sold individually. If you look through the auction, you will find additional items where a bedrock version was sold along with the normal version. Or there are a number of items where a number 4 was thrown in with something else. And it's obviously because the number 4 they felt didn't have much value, and their minimum bid started generally at $50. And if they felt the 4 or any other planes didn't make that minimum requirement, they bundled it with something else, hoping that the person would pay a little bit more for that something else, or at least that they would get rid of it for the buyer and it wouldn't be a problem. those types of items I haven't taken into consideration, and you'll have to go through this video to see what they actually got. But for the most part, we get an idea of value out of this. The number ones, there was 5 of them, and that's including the one that was broken and the Frankenstein with the corrugated base that wasn't a Stanley base. On average, they brought in for the seller $1,700. What I found interesting was the number 2s. 2 of those sold for an average of $744. They've gone up quite significantly in value. To me, it wasn't that long ago that number 2s were bought for $100, maybe $200. And all of a sudden I'm looking at them selling at an auction site where a lot of the items of a higher value have gone for about half their value. And a number 2 is sitting there at $744, which means a number 2 is worth around about $1,000 to $1,400 at the moment. That one surprises me. The number 3s were more realistic in my mind at 176, and there was a couple that went for a higher value than that, and a couple that went for a lower value than that, and it was based on their age, which would be expected. The number 4s at 153. There was some items on the 4s that, like I say, they were bundled up. So these 3 4s, if you go through, you'll find that there's something unique about those ones that adds the value to them. I haven't done that, but there'll be a reason why they're 153, because a number 4 plane generally you can pick up for $40 to $60 in good condition. A rusted one, yeah, between $10 and $30. So I expect that these number 4s were new in box type sales, and that they were early items with the box manual and brand new, still wrapped in their wax paper type thing. I haven't gone through and looked, so don't quote me on that, but I suspect that they're heading towards that level of a number 4. The 5s and 6s, that was about where you'd expect to see them. 7s I thought were a little bit low to where I thought they would be, and the 8s were about right to where I thought they would be. We got into the 62s, and there were 7 of those, and they did end up going for prices that they would normally pull on eBay going back a year or 2 ago. I haven't looked at them recently, so I expect they probably go for more now, but they seemed a reasonable price for me. The number 45s were quite interesting. They went a lot cheaper than what they've been going on eBay, and once again, around about the half mark. But there was one buyer that seemed to be trying to snag up as many 45s as they could. Yet the 55s were spread over multiple buyers. I don't think there was one buyer that bought 2 55s. Having a quick look through the list, I'm pretty sure they all went to separate buyers. And on average, they're a little bit lower than I kind of expected. Then we get into the 10s. The 10s are about right. The 10.5s, yeah, they were about right. The 10.25, I kind of expected them to go for a little bit more, but there were 6 of them. How many people are in the market for a 10.25? That's a big question. But on average, they went for $527, which sets those, somewhere between the $8 to $1,000 via the eBay, taking the attitude that it's about the half. There was one 72 and 72.5 in a set. So that is, it had the standard nose, the bull nose, and the beading attachment, all in the one set. That one went for $725, which normally a 72 with the bull nose would go for about $1,000, and the 72.5, if it had its blades, etc., would go somewhere between $600 and $1,000. So that one is, clearly about half the value. The other one of interest was a 51 and 52, which is the shooting plane and the shooting board pair, the 51 being the plane, the 52 being the board. The plane was missing its tote and the bolt, so you would have to replace those. But even still, normally 51s by themselves will go for more than $1,000. The 51 and 52 combined is very hard to find. You can replace a tote, you can make a tote, you can get a replacement bolt off another plane that will fit. That's not a problem. Combined, those two I've seen going in excess of $3,000. So this one was bought for about a third of its value. I'll dig a little bit deeper on the number ones because the number ones interest a lot of people. And the one that really surprised me was the corrugated bottom number one, the Frankenstein, which had Stanley fixtures on another company's base. They went for $1,860. That's right in line with how the full Stanleys sold. That plane used to be one to avoid. It's obviously now considered to be a collectible one, or there are a number of bidders there that didn't know that Stanley didn't make a corrugated number one and bid for it thinking it was a very unique number one, which I would have expected it to go on higher if that was the case. But if they knew it was a Frankenstein, I'd expect it to go lower. That price did surprise me. And it surprised me as well that the broken one, which most of it wasn't broken, it was just missing its tote and the bolt that holds it there, went for $744. Now that's easily fixed up, either a new tote purchased or made, and a bolt acquired, and you'd have that running for $1,000, no problem at all, more than likely less. And that one, I think, was kind of a bit of the bargain of the day as well. The remainder of them, the highest one, the first number one to go, got $2,356. Recently on eBay, I've seen a couple go for $3,200. And these are all Australian dollars, in case you're overseas and were wondering. So that one was sort of a bit on the expensive side, based on the half value type position. But the next two went for $1,800 each. So there was obviously a bit of bidding war for that first one. I didn't look at the details of them, but the number ones didn't span a large period in time. And there's not a lot of differences between them. So a bit of a bidding war on that first one. I'm not sure why. And the next two a bit less, but they both went for the 1,800 mark. So that 1,800 mark is less slightly than the one that actually wasn't a Stanley. That I find really interesting. Shows just how strange the market can be sometimes. As I said, there was one bidder for the 45s. That one bidder didn't win all the 45s. There were 14 of them, but that one bidder did get quite a number of the 45s and the 55s to individuals. Another thing that I found quite interesting, and it's not really about the planes, it was just a quirky little thing that tickled my fancy, was that the person that set up the auction, they matched the plane numbers to the lot number more often than not. 1s through to 13, lot 1 through to 13 had planes 1 through to 13. There was a 45 on the 45, there was 55 on the 55, there was a 113 on lot 113, 62 on the lot 62. And you found these throughout the auction, that an individual plane had been lined up with a lot number. So it tells me that whoever set this up first started off by assigning planes to lot numbers based on the plane number and then went back and filled in the gaps. Quite amusing. It's not often that someone setting up an auction would have that opportunity. How many things are sold are based on numbers. There's not a lot. So I'm happy that someone in that auction house had a bit of fun here, and I'm happy that I noticed it, and hopefully they watch this video at some point and know that someone noticed it and got a chuckle out of it. Hopefully it makes their day. So for me, that's the end of this video. I'm not going to talk anymore, but I will let the rest of this video run through. It's almost finished, but feel free to scroll backwards and forwards at your will to look at the rest, including some books at the end and magazines. It was a very interesting auction to watch. It was very interesting to see the bidding on the auction. I hope recording it and stripping it back just to the hammer fall points in time is of value to you, and the little bit of analysis that I've done around the auction I hope is of value to you. And when it comes to selling your collection, I hope this information helps you to decide what's the most valuable way for you to go about it in regards to money, time and stress. No matter whether you are a user or a collector, happy hunting.